Welcome back with hopefully a kind of quick video. In my previous recent record purchases video, I already mentioned that I bought so many records over the past couple of weeks, because for the most time I was ill, I was sick, so I hadn't anything better to do than to browse for some records and then listen to them. And here's four more records I bought in like March, I would say, and they have some kind of common thread, so I thought I put those four in a video now. And it's the theme of overindulgent, maybe slightly pretentious albums, concept albums, double albums. Not all of those albums are concept albums, and not all of those albums are double albums, but what they all have in common is they don't even really take themselves too seriously. They're not really that serious albums, but there's some kind of pretentiousness and some kind of, lack of quality control, I would say, with some of those, or with most of those. And it's a bit of a controversial video, because at least one of those three albums, maybe two, but at least one of those albums is a classic, and we'll start with it now to get it out of the way. The Who Sell Out. I finally bought The Who Sell Out. A couple of months ago I made a video about the 30 Years of Maximum Overdrive, or whatever it's called, 4 CD compilation, which is like the equivalent of that The Who had for the Beatles' Blue and Red album, but also a bit of the Beatles anthology project, because it's their hits but also like outtakes, and it's brilliant. But I told you also in that video that I was never really a die-hard fan of The Who. That's why this 4 CD box set is really the perfect thing for me, because these selections, to me they're awesome. And the Who, first and foremost, to me were a brilliant singles band, especially in the 60s, and I never was really that big of a fan of their big concept albums. I have Quadrophenia and Tommy. I think they're both okay. They're my two favorite Who albums, I would say. I also have Who's Next, which is, especially to Americans, the big classic, but I don't really like it. I like the song Won't Get Fooled Again. It's a classic, of course. I'm not really a fan of that album. But I always thought I would be a big fan of this album, and I listened to it like 20 years ago when a friend lent it to me. And, funny thing is, I don't really have any memories of it from 20 years ago, which could be a sign that I wasn't too impressed with it. But also that friend back then, or was it 15 years ago, said that's the Who album for you, because I was like a bit critical of them. I like the Who, but I'm not a die-hard fan. And he tried to convince me that I would like this phase of the Who. And I always thought I would like it, but since I can't remember anything from listening to it 15 years ago, I was, kind of interested what I would go away with now that I bought this deluxe edition. And I still really am not a big fan of it. It's not a double album, and it wasn't called a concept album back in the day, because maybe the term concept album 1967 wasn't really yet a term. I mean, the Beatles kind of started it in that year, but it was still a fresh thing. But it feels like a concept album because it has a concept. Unlike many other so-called concept albums, Sgt. Pepper, for example, you don't really know what is the concept. But this has never been really called a concept album, but it has a clear concept, which is this spoofing of radio station signations and ads, advertisements, and that stuff. So it has a concept, but it's never been called a concept album. And it's kind of true to that concept, and it has the big classic I Can See for Miles. Like I said, I'm a big fan of the Who's singles, especially from this era, from the 60s. A best of, with just a single A-side, that would be one of the best-ofs that any band ever, can have. But on album length, I'm not really a big fan of that album, I have to say, but it's okay. You know, it's definitely not a bad album, but I don't see it as the classic that many people see it as. And I also think that's when the Who start to become a bit pretentious and a bit overindulgent, and which would go on with the rock operas later on. But you know, it has a sense of humor, so it's also a bit conscious of that. So I have to give it that. The next album is let's do it chronologically. The next album is I think from 1970 or 1969. 1969 it says, and I think recorded in 1968. It's the famous or infamous double album the Bee Gees did. You know, even the Bee Gees had a double album. And this, in my opinion, you know, I bought it also in March, like those other things. This is really a case of when a band shouldn't have made an album into a double album, you know, with just the best, like 10 songs, maybe, of these, what's it, 9, 14, I think it's 17 or 18 songs, as a single album with just 10 songs and maybe a bit more careful production of those 10 songs, you know, put more time, more effort into those 10 best songs, whatever they are. It would be a good Bee Gees album, still not, by far not their best album in my opinion. But you know, these half-baked ideas, these kind of songs which are far from their best songs even at that time. You know, they had far better songs on, you know, the year before, for example, 1967, for example, with their debut. It's really a lifeless, boring, dull double album. Everything kind of sounds the same. I know they're huge fans of this album, and it's like also like a dark horse record, a cult record maybe for Bee Gees fans. But you know, I was really disappointed, and I like the Bee Gees. I think they're excellent songwriters, the songs they wrote for themselves, but also for others, especially in the 70s. And I like their disco phase in the second half of the 70s. And I also respect their 60s and early 70s stuff. So I have nothing against the Bee Gees. But this is really not a good album, and it's really an example for a bad, bloated double album that should never have been made, and at least not made a double album, maybe a single album. And I think those lifeless performances or production, it's also a result of them not really being involved in the production and the music. You know, I read a Wikipedia article on that album, and it's all session musicians. You know, they just, of course, they wrote the songs, but those not very good Bee Gees songs, but they just sing. And I think there's one song when one of the three Bee Gees brothers plays piano in the background, but all the other instruments done by session musicians, and it, you know, it sounds like that. It's really not, you know, if you're going to make an album and you know this is probably not our best songs, not our most exciting work, then you really should not make it a double album. So Odessa, really not a good album. The next is also, of course, a very overindulgent and one could say pretentious double album, but I like it. This is, of the three albums we've talked about so far, the next is going to be my favorite. And like with The Who Sell Out, I was always familiar with it. The Who Sell Out, like I said, I've forgotten about my impressions from 15 or 20 years ago. But this album, I never really forgot what I liked about it. I have the CD version since like when I was a teenager, and now I finally got the vinyl version of the infamous triple album. In this case, it's not a double album, it's a triple album. You know, they already had the double album with London Calling, the album before, so that's the self-indulgent, the overindulgent, the pretentious thing about it. It was like we have to step up we have to dial it up even more from a double album. We can't go back to a single album or to another double album. It has to be a triple album. That's like the wrong thinking process. You know, you should, like a football coach, you should make the best tactic for the player he has, and you know, you should make the best album for the songs you have. And again, this could have been a brilliant single album. You know, as a single album, it would almost maybe be as good as London Calling, which is not just in my, but also in my opinion, the best album. And even as a double album, it would be very good. Not as good as London Calling, but very good double album. But you know, they thought we have to make this a triple, so to stand out again after London Calling with it. But I like it. You know, it's, you know, how do you make a brilliant triple album with no fillers? That's even the Beatles couldn't pull that off. So you have to respect them for the kind of chutzpah that they had to try this even, and it has its moments. You know, I could easily make an album with 10 songs that is a masterpiece. The Magnificent Seven, for example, big Clash classic. Hitsville UK is great. Somebody Got Murdered, one of my top 3 songs from that album. Then there are nice dub songs, you know, there's not really a standout dub track, but it's really an interesting, you know, 2 or 3 of those would be really like giving it a good, you know, kind of spice. The great cover of Police on My Back, it's like I Fought the Law Part 2. I Fought the Law is one of my favorite, it's not written by them, but one of my favorites recordings by The Clash, and Police on My Back is almost as good. The Equalizer is cool. The Call Up is one of my favorites of that album. So there's lots of good stuff on it. There's also funny stuff. So, you know, The Clash always were labeled a band that maybe takes themselves a bit too serious, but there's humor on this album, which, you know, when people talk about this album, because it's called Sandinista, I haven't even mentioned the title yet, Sandinista, of course they refer to it as a very political album, you know, Sandinista, that was this Latin American guerrilla war thing, left wing against the USA or the CIA, something like that. And of course, left wing Clash on the side of the guerrillas. And it was always, you know, seen as an album about that. But you know, that's just 2 or 3 songs on that album. The most obvious is which one is it? Washington Bullets is practically like the kind of title song of the album, but the rest is really a fun romp, one could say, like London Calling also was, and very eclectic. So it's not a perfect album, it takes itself too serious in places, it's maybe too overambitious, but it's a great album, and I'm glad they did it the way they did it, although it has some, you know, some of the fillers are really they are the 100% definition of what a filler is, in my opinion. And in the beginning I said I'm talking about 4 albums today, but I always said it's just 3 of those pretentious albums, because a 4th album I bought around the time I bought these 3, I want to show as an example of the opposite. I'm in a kind of go-betweens phase at the moment, Australian band from Brisbane, of course. So I re-listen to lots of the stuff, you know, some albums I have for years now, and I'm familiar with, you know, basically I'm familiar with the story of that band, but it's also like a phases band. There are those artists, like Neil Young is a perfect example for me, where you, like 5 years you don't listen to anything by Neil Young or the Go-Betweens, for example, and then you have a phase where you really religiously listening to it for 1 month, you know, constantly. And now I'm in a go-betweens phase. I think my last go-betweens phase must have been 20 years ago, you know, around the time when they had to break up because Grant McLennan, you know, died, I think in 2005 or 2006, and that's why they broke up. But around the time of the last album, Oceans Apart, from I think 2005, I was really in a heavy go-betweens phase. But one of the albums I never had by them, I also bought in March, and this brought this go-betweens phase back. It's Liberty Bell and the Black Diamond Express, and I wanted to show this in this video about pretentious, self-importance, overblown, bloated albums as an example for the opposite. You know, this is really a small album, a small indie album that wants to be a small indie album, that doesn't try to achieve anything else, and by doing so it's better than any of these 3 other albums, which all are albums that sound like they were made with, at that time, with huge budgets and huge visions, and, you know, they clash even with like manifestos they wrote beforehand about what they're going to record. This is just two great songwriters writing, how many is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Writing 10 brilliant songs, you know. They often, Robert Forster and Grant McLennan often were called the Lennon and McCartney of the 80s, or the Australian Lennon and McCartney. I would say the Australian Lennon and McCartney, because the Lennon and McCartney of the 80s would be the Pet Shop Boys for me personally. But they surely were the Australian Lennon McCartney, with Robert Forster being more the Lennon guy and Grant McLennan, you know, Mac Lennon, it almost sounds like McCartney, being the Paul McCartney guy, the melodic guy. And like with the Beatles, like with Lennon McCartney, they figured out the perfect mix between the more dry and maybe more slightly sinister, artistic Robert Forster tracks and the very happy-go-lucky, pop-tastic, hook-line loaded Grant McLennan tracks. And on the best tracks it's combined. And you know, a song like Spring Rain, which opens the album, that's really the perfect example of the opposite of what an album like Sandinista tried to do. This is really like a easy, breezy pop song, but with, you know, with serious kind of undertones. But it's not like on the nose, like it wants to show you how clever it is. It's clever, but in a, you know, in a small, in a humble way, one could say. So I really enjoyed this album. I enjoyed it the most of the 4 albums I've shown today. And I'm going to prolong my go-betweens phase. I'm going to re-listen to all the stuff I already have, and I'm going to fill out the blanks. I'm going to purchase the 2 or 3 albums I don't have of the go-betweens yet, and maybe later that year I will do either ranking all the go-betweens albums video, or just another video summing up my impressions from you know, the insight I gained from this go-betweens phase that I'm going through right now. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.